Good day. Today we are going to focus on inequality and land markets. So we will start there to refresh what does multidimensional inequality mean. Then we will shift to understanding land access and that this is subject to the nature of land markets in cities. We will then try and clarify how does value get created in land markets and how is this driven by property cycles. We will then explore African cities in that they are not just, in the conventional sense, a market with freehold title, but there are multiple overlapping and competing approaches to land use. Let's revisit what we mean by multidimensional inequality. Inequality is often thought of simply as income inequality, and the indicator for that is the Gini coefficient. What we've suggested is when you, as an urbanist or someone interested in urban development, try and come to terms with inequality, you've got to appreciate that income inequality is merely one aspect of economic inequality. The other aspects are how do you participate in the labor market and how do you access assets and wealth in your city. Now, when we move on from economic inequality, we also have to recognize social inequality. And this speaks to unequal access to education, to health, nutritional food, and of course, safety. Now, both economic and social inequality are underpinned by infrastructural inequality. In other words, the degree to which you have access to energy, water, sanitation, waste, affordable transport, and safe public and green space. Now, these three dimensions, economic inequality, social inequality, infrastructural inequality, they are not addressed unless political inequality is confronted. And that means that the urban poor, those at the receiving end of inequality, find their voice. And that in cultural terms, they express their rights to have a place in the city, to express that they want to be part of the city. And so we know that demanding political rights, asserting cultural rights, is often the mechanism by which these other forms of inequality is addressed. Now, in this particular session, what we want to do is zoom in on land as a key asset that underpins wealth creation. And once we understand how land markets operate, we can appreciate how access to land or the absence of it reproduces and deepens inequality in the city. But this is only one aspect of economic inequality. Now, I'm going to use South Africa and Cape Town in particular as a reference point because it helps us to understand what the trends have been over the last 10 years or so, but also in some of the other sessions we've done, we've produced examples or we've explored examples in relation to Cape Town, and so this offers us some continuity. Now, this is data from 2021 produced by the Statistical Services of South Africa, and it shows what the property markets have done in the various metropolitan government areas of South Africa. And what this shows is that over an 11-year period, Cape Town has outperformed all other cities in South Africa. The property market grew by 141% over that period. The average for these 9 metropolitan areas was 98%. So we are going to engage with a Cape Town context where you've got a very healthy and a fast-growing property market. Now, in this slide, what you can see is the segmentation of the residential property market in Cape Town. So there are 5 slices to the cake. The green slice are those residential properties that are worth less than 300,000 Rand in South African currency. That is, in today's prices, about $16,000. Then the blue slice of the cake are those properties that are worth between 300,000 and 600,000. Then we go on to the orange slice, which are properties that are worth between 600,000 and 900,000 South African rands. Now, that is more or less where the upper end of the working class or the lower end of the middle class ends. And now we go over into the properties that sit squarely in the middle class market and in the upper class market. So the next slice are those properties that are above 900,000 but less than 1.2 million. And the last slice, and this is of course where the wealth in the city sits, are all the properties that are worth above 1.2 million in Cape Town. And what you will see is that we have a column in the table which is after the percentage share of those different categories that talks about the total number of government subsidized houses. Now, this is very important because it reflects an explicit attempt by the South African government to redistribute land and to create an asset base for the poor in South Africa. What does this mean? It basically comes together as a housing subsidy. The housing subsidy is 100% if your income is below a certain threshold. In other words, you're a poor household. You can then go onto a waiting list and say that I deserve access to that opportunity or to that 100% subsidy. The subsidy will give you a house, which is a total of 42 square meters, and you get the title deed of the property that the house is on. So what you will see is that if you look at the final column in that table, that for the first two slices of the cake, the government is responsible for the largest proportion of that stock. In fact, for almost 87% of all the housing that is worth less than 300,000 is enabled by the government subsidy. And unsurprisingly, when you go to the other end of the market, there's no government participation because those are people who can access mortgage finance from banks and other financial institutions to buy the properties that they want. But most of the people in the first three slices of the pie are not able to access private mortgage finance because they are regarded as too high a risk by the banks and financial institutions. Now, this is data from 2019. It would have shifted a little bit by today, but not by much. So let's move on with the story, staying with Cape Town. So what this map shows is, if you remember the different colors of the pie that we looked at, all the reds are properties that are worth more than 1.2 million South African rands. And you will see that they cluster in an arc to the left of the city. And that represents the wealthier suburbs of Cape Town and the central business district. All of the green circles are where the majority of the urban poor live in Cape Town, in informal settlements, in townships, and in what we call shacks, in the backyards of houses in the townships. And so there's a very clear geography. So the value of the land where the green circles are is significantly lower to the value of the land where the red circles are. In other words, the land market of Cape Town is highly unequal, and that inequality is reproduced by the ways in which the market operates. So this requires of us to just quickly go back to those different colors in the pie chart. And this is data of a few years earlier, in other words, in 2015. And we've got one category less. So we took out the category between 900 and 1.2 million. So we go from 600 to 1.2. So we've got four slices to the pie. And again, everyone below 600,000, all those properties, represents, as you can see, 30 plus 17, 47% of all the properties in Cape Town. But when you look at the value of the properties, you will see that the 47% of properties in Cape Town is only worth 9% of the total value of the land market in Cape Town. The 31% of the stock that's above 1.2 million represents 77% of the value in Cape Town. So that's the structure of the market, and that is why we've got these extremely divergent variations in valuation of the different parts of the property market. Now, underpinning the private market that is driven by bank finance is something called the property cycle. Now, the property cycle goes through these phases over a period of about 15 to 20 years, where the market slows down. In other words, the price of a house may be 1 million, and because there are too many houses at that price point in the market, there's not enough interest. And then the price of that house goes down to 950,000 because the owners are desperate to sell. That's the slowdown part of the market. then people lose confidence in the market and it slumps. And prices go down often by 10, 15, 20%. And then you have a situation where there are more sellers in the market than there are buyers. And then at a certain point, because the price has reached a certain low, a lot of the buyers say, okay, this is a good moment to get into the market because I can now afford it, because the monthly repayment on my mortgage is going to be less. And when enough people enter that phase in their lives, we get into the recovery phase of the market. And then all of the developers want to get in on the game. And then they begin to build more and more houses, provide more and more flat opportunities, and the market overheats or it booms, and then the cycle repeats itself. Now, again, it's important to remember that this applies only to the red and to the orange slices of that pie. This does not apply to the section of the market where the state is active. Now, why is this the case? So on the left-hand side, you will see the structure of wealth in the South African context. 40% of the population only account for 1%. The top 5% of the population in South Africa accounts for 70% of the wealth in South African society. So when you look at the graph on the right-hand side, the light blue component of the bars shows you the proportion of people who've needed state support to access a residential property. And it is 87% for those properties under 300,000, and for the next band it is 41%. And then it tapers off at 10% for those between 600 and 900,000. And that typically is not a conventional 42 square meter house. Those are typically people who purchase a rental unit and the government supports them to access the finance to rent affordably. Now, you've got to keep in mind, if you can't access finance to purchase a property or upgrade your property after the state has given it to you, the value of your property will not increase significantly. Now, if, as we have in South Africa and in Cape Town, unemployment is high and or wages are very low, then poor households are unable to access finance affordably to grow their assets. Poor households are, of course, concentrated in low-value parts of the city. And often state investments in housing and public infrastructure is not enough to attract private investment to raise the potential yield or value of that area. As values continue to rise in middle class and upper class areas, the gap between those and the blues and the greens will continue to grow. Inequality and land are clearly one of the biggest challenges facing political and policy leaders in Africa. We need much better data about the current patterns of land access, ownership and value to inform more inclusive approaches for the future.